go. Ooh, this is a bit odd. Good morning, everyone. This is our first in-person event in about a year and a half, and I'm sure for many of you it's the first in-person event too. So you've got two speakers today, myself and Gavin. We're going to introduce ourselves and the talk in a moment. If you see me walking around and looking like I'm going to trip over something or walk in front of the screen, please do grab me and let me know. If I'm a bit awkward in terms of what I'm doing with my legs or where I put my hands, it's because I'm not used to standing in front of a wonderful audience like this in person. But we're going to be talking about, I think, a topic that you're hearing in a lot of different talks and discussions today, hybrid working. Being based in an office has been normal for so many of us, and now the remote element of hybrid working practices is where we can find a lot of huge potential, but also some perils and challenges. So you're going to hear from two of us today, talking about psychological research into people that will love and loathe hybrid working and how you can help people be more successful. Hopefully some takeaways for yourself as individuals too. And you're also going to hear from Gavin Smith from Brompton Bikes, who'll be able to tell you a bit more about practical applications of insight into hybrid working and real-world experiences. So to start with some introductions, my name's Jayson Darby. I'm the Director of Science at a company called Thomas International. We develop software that's powered by psychological assessments to help with recruitment and development applications and decision making. So because there's a lot of psychology behind what we do oodles and oodles of research. And one of the topics we've been exploring over the last year and a half is remote and hybrid working and what science can tell you about it. So I'll talk a little bit about that today. And Gavin?
And I'm Gavin Smith. I'm the People Director from Brompton Bicycle. And as Jayson said, for me, this is the first time I've actually been out in a very long time. So seeing a lot of faces is brilliant. I'm here, as Jayson says, to talk about how we've partnered with Thomas, which we have done now for 4 years. And when we started our relationship back in 2017, our business was only about 250 employees. This year, we're going to be hitting about the 850 mark. So rapid growth, but equally with that growth has come the relationship with Thomas, and to, at best, expand on the use of the PPAs and the TQs with the business. So hopefully I'll be able to give you some more insights as we go along.
And also, we've got people in the room here with us today, and there's lots of people watching us online as well, so thank you for everyone that's joining. We're going to ask you some questions at the start of the presentation, and we ask for anyone that's watching online, we're not going to see if you raise your hand to some of our questions, but please do drop some comments into the chat, because we can see the comments you're raising if you're viewing us online as well. But first question, some people seem to love and loathe some of the remote elements of hybrid working. So when we're considering the blended experiences many organizations are adopting now between some time in office, some time from home, what's the right blend? What's the right balance? Some companies that we're speaking to are experiencing a lot of potential. They're finding more job accessibility. The candidate pools and catchment areas they can recruit from are larger. They're finding that it's easier to accommodate flexible work requests. Better DE&I outcomes. It's now far easier to work in a more flexible and hybrid manner around childcare commitments, family commitments, learning and development commitments. Some organizations see much higher productivity when people are able to do some of their work remotely. Some businesses report higher engagement. But there can also be some perils. We hear people speaking of weakened team dynamics, making it harder to onboard people without that in-person interaction and training. Sometimes less organic learning just from being around people and absorbing information. Sometimes a bit more increased conflict when you're speaking via email or Teams or Zoom or Slack rather than in person. So a question for me and Gavin. Who here has experienced more of the potentials from hybrid working in their organization, and who has experienced more of the perils? Can we get a show of hands of, do you see more of the positives at the moment in your own experience? And what about the negatives? Has anyone seen more of the negatives? Okay, interesting. Gavin, any comments or reflections on that?
Well, I mean, we in all fairness, we've probably seen both. But we were, I don't know what word you would use. I keep saying we were fortunate that we still worked throughout the pandemic. So when you've had to react constantly to changes from government and internally change the workplace and how we work and react to how we onboard. So we had a very interactive onboarding program that suddenly all went online. And this year our focus is on how do you kind of step back from that, reintroduce a more immersive onboarding, but then we have probably about 120 people that have probably not met a lot of the people that are in the business. So how do you get those re-engaged? So they will be joining the latest iteration of our on-site onboarding program.
It's interesting to see some of the people online as well. In the room, the vast majority was saying you've seen more of the positives rather than the negatives. Online, we're seeing people saying, yeah, a mixture of both, especially positives. And one commenter here said, seeing some of the positives, but yes to weaker team dynamics, especially when we all suddenly had to go remote and we had no choice at the beginning of the pandemic. Some of us were already in teams, we already had relationships, then you went remote. But if you joined businesses in the last year and a half, you may just meet a small sliver of people, maybe the immediate teams you work with, rather than a wider group. And I'm sure each and every one of us reacted differently last year when we suddenly realized, oh, this isn't going to be a couple of weeks until Easter. Oh, it's not just going to be until the summer. And now here we are today talking about this enduring change to our working practices. Some people are going to love it. Some people are going to loathe it. And understanding people's behavioral and personality styles can help us support people and identify who might struggle more. So working in an office, commuting, that was the norm for the majority of people, especially if you were in roles that were traditionally office-based or if you were going on site. The remote element is the new part of hybrid. Having to factor in home working predominantly was a new thing for the majority of people. But from psychological research, we know there are certain characteristics where people adapt really well to different working styles, but there are characteristics where people will really struggle. So people that enjoy new things, they enjoy change. You're changing a team structure, a project, changing different priorities. I love it. People get bored easily. People that set their own goals are quite composed under pressure. These are the sort of characteristics that individuals that have these, they'll probably love hybrid working because there's a mix. They're goal-oriented, they can set their own priorities. However, if you're the sort of person that really enjoys stability and consistency, the last year and a half or so would have been really challenging, even more so than it was for most people. Avoiding stress and pressure, if that really helps you stay engaged by not having a pressured environment, hybrid working might be a challenge if it's a new thing for you, a new way of working. All this sounds great. So, okay, we know that there are certain characteristics of people that will love or loathe hybrid working, but how can we measure this and actually get this insight? There are 6 critical personality traits. So human personality is exceedingly complex in places, but one thing that psychologists agree on and difficult often to find consensus, is that there are certain core personality traits that are highly predictive of things like job success, personal well-being in the workplace. This is a model that we're familiar with, so obviously I'm presenting here from Thomas International, this is a model that we use, but these are 6 really important traits that a lot of research into remote working has used. So traits like conscientiousness, are you very detail-oriented and very goal-oriented? How adjusted are you? Do you experience stress really easily, or do you find it easy to stay composed under pressure? Are you open to new ideas? Are you very curious, or do you like tried and tested methods as a safe way to get things done predictably? How do you approach risk? How do you deal with ambiguity? How competitive are you? All these areas give us insight into how people adapt to changing situations. Hybrid working being one of the biggest changes that we're having to adapt to in businesses at the moment. So there's a reason I'm sharing this with you now, because just before the pandemic, in January 2020, a fantastic study was published using these personality traits, looking at people that were working remotely before the pandemic. So these 2 professors, Ian McRae and Roberta Sawatsky, conducted research over many months, hundreds and hundreds of people who were working remotely before the pandemic to identify what are the common characteristics of people who choose to work in a remote manner before this became normal for all of us. So an extremely well-timed piece of research because we were able to compare to this with data that we captured during the pandemic. So these 3 characteristics were exceptionally more common in people that chose to work remotely before the pandemic. people who were extremely success-oriented, sometimes veering slightly on being perfectionists, people that have exceptionally high standards, are extremely resilient and composed under pressure, and love change. These were the sort of people that were being drawn to working either in industries that had a more remote element, or just to work more remotely in the roles that they had at the moment. So we used this as an anchor because we said, okay, we know what's common in people that enjoy remote working because they've chosen to do it before the pandemic. What happened after March 2020 in the UK? We all suddenly had to work from home. We started capturing data from individuals that were completing assessments to see if they could tell us more about the challenges or struggles that they were facing. So this is one study. So there were many, many studies which took place. Obviously, for the nature of this talk, I'm going to show you one. Please do come and chat to us at the stand where we can show you some of the other research we've done as well. But this was one study we looked at where we had, at this point, we looked at 256 people so that we could get some good statistical confidence out of the data we looked at, who were all working remotely. And we were asking people about their experiences of engagement, their experiences of feeling burnt out, and their self-rated performance. How did they find remote working was impacting these areas? Could we see a relationship between people's personality styles and whether they were experiencing more engagement, more risk of burnout? Was it impacting their performance? So here's a snapshot. I'm going to go into each of these in a little bit more detail. So again, we found that these were the traits that had a huge impact on engagement, first of all, but also getting lost in your work, experiencing burnout, and cyber slacking, which I'm sure, obviously I've never done this, but I'm sure some of us may at times have been on a Zoom call and maybe you've got Amazon open in the background, or maybe you looked at your mobile phone. I mean, of course, I haven't done that. I'm sure none of you have. But cyber slacking is a phenomena that we are seeing in people that work remotely on a hybrid basis. So I'm just going to dig into some of these in a little bit more detail. So people that had really high conscientiousness, they set themselves goals, targets, have very high standards, were far more likely to say that they were getting lost in their work, which can sound like a positive, and at times it can be. You know, when you're just going through meetings, you're working, and then you look and it's lunchtime, and you've actually had a really positive morning. You've got lost in your work. It can be a really positive, engaging experience. But it can also be a slight negative if you take it too far. If you're getting lost in your work and you're working long hours, or you're working for your lunch break, factoring in also that hybrid or home element of the workplace and your home are starting to blur together slightly, the perfectionistic side of very high conscientiousness can be a challenge. So it's an area to monitor. And so these observations were supporting some of the original research that took place in 2020. People that had these characteristics were far more likely to work remotely, but now everyone's having to. So if you have really high conscientiousness, are you going to be more effective working in a hybrid manner? Are you going to struggle if you've got lower levels of this trait? How can you do something about it? That's what I'm getting to. People that have got lower adjustment levels, so they experience stress more quickly, slightly less composed under pressure. People with lower ambiguity acceptance, so don't like change, don't like uncertainty, really like clarity and consistency, told us that they were far more likely to experience burnout. Now, I hope none of you have experienced burnout before, but unfortunately, at times it does, it's something we all experience at times in our career. People working remotely, it can lead to increased burnout if you're not able to cope with some of the demands or pressures that changing working style can present. So again, if you know this about people that you're supporting, you can do something about it. The reason that we measure these characteristics and conduct this sort of research is to help us inform content and experiences to say, if you know you have people in your team with these characteristics, what can you do to better support them if they're working in a remote or hybrid manner? And a final snapshot of the findings were, again, people with lower adjustments, so people who experience stress or negative emotions more frequently, were far more likely to say that they procrastinated or engaged in cyber slacking behaviors. So we thank them for their honesty. But quite often, some of the additional qualitative comments were people were doing it to avoid stresses of work. You know, you've got lots of team messages popping up, lots of emails, people trying to Zoom you. People would distract themselves from potentially stressful information or messages. It does not mean that every person that has some of these characteristics will experience some of these challenges. But if you know this information about a person, you can help them. You know what questions to ask. You're aware of this before you engage with them. If you're supporting people or managing people, having insight into people's characteristics like this can help us support people that are adapting to hybrid practices or who are having a remote element, increasing in the role that they're doing. So before I hand to Gavin, just to close, this is me, which is probably exceedingly narcissistic, but I just wanted to give you a snapshot of me, because ultimately you can use psychology to your advantage. We're measuring these characteristics and then providing content about individuals and how they're going to adapt to remote working, how do they deal with the hybrid nature of the role. So what we often do internally to support our own teams, we turn this insight on ourselves the moment the pandemic happened, because we were stood there in March and April, just like all of you, thinking, how do we support all of our people through the challenges we're facing? And we started looking at how our own insight into personality and behavioral styles could be used to inform how to help people. So I've got really high conscientiousness. That's great. I set myself goals and targets. I also burn out really easily because I take on too much and struggle to say no if someone asks for help on a project. I know that about myself because I'm fortunate enough to get this insight. Does my line manager know? Were they able to use that and factor that into workload planning with me? Or were somebody able to say, hey, your adjustment levels are slightly higher than average, but how are you feeling in terms of stress and pressure? Are you finding that you're getting overwhelmed a little bit more easily? These are all questions that we can ask anyway when we're trying to support people. But when you're time poor and you're trying to get directly to the most valuable conversation you can have with someone you're supporting, psychological insight can help. And we know that what we're presenting isn't just our thoughts and our opinions, but we can back it up with research. But I'm sure all of this sounds great. What I wanted to do is to hand to Gavin to talk to you about the experiences they had at Brompton Bikes, because they took this and actually put it into practice to support their own people as they adapted around the hybrid working demands that we had. So Gavin, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? So, I think for us, I think a good place to touch on is when we talked about inducting people back into the business. So, we've had a number of people about 110 people that have never been on site, have only just started in the last few months coming in, seeing people they've never seen before, getting re-engaged through an onboarding program specifically for new starters coming back on site. But we've been developing what we call management development days, which we ran throughout COVID. And we started this back in 2019, and it was using the PPAs, so our teams could get to know themselves, not only as an individual, but also, how well do they engage with their line manager. Now that, we continue to work that through the COVID. It worked very well, virtually, online. But the difference we've seen probably in the last 3 months, 12 departments have really latched onto that. And now that the opportunity to get face-to-face, obviously in COVID-safe environments, that is really supporting them getting to know their team members that they may have only seen on a screen for the last 12 months, but also for those team members to understand the dynamics of what does it feel to work with people face-to-face rather than just over a screen. The other element that we're really focusing on is, hybrid working is here to stay as far as we're concerned. The irony for us is the site that we have, we knew we would be outgrowing that. So just prior to the pandemic, I think it was the weekend before, we were all working from home to try out this new Teams application to see if the systems would work and the infrastructure would be there. Little did we know by the Wednesday, everybody in the world would be using Teams or Zoom. So we'd already knew that our future forward was hybrid working. So to some of the points that Jayson's made, throughout the pandemic, yes, we've worked with our line managers who have struggled with the remote working sensibilities. And we've actually utilised the remote working report that comes off the back of the PPA. That's been very useful for us to support managers in suggesting some of their online development and how they address their teams. Another interesting factor that came out of the pandemic was upon the last 3 months for people coming back into the workplace, been doing a lot of one-to-ones, a lot of engagement with our teams. And what seems to be coming out was there was a trend that people felt slightly more empowered when they were at home. Now, we're doing a piece of work on site to get some of the guys that started with us prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic to redo their PPAs to see whether there's been any significant change in their disc profiles. We don't know the answer at this stage, but what it does seem to suggest anecdotally is employees that were on the other side of the screen felt more empowered than they possibly would be in an open environment where naturally we know ourselves, there's people will speak in an open meeting, others will step back. But because of the structure that was forced in through the pandemic, people felt a lot more open about opening up about how they felt and expressing their opinions. So that's been a useful aspect for us to develop moving forward.
And we've had really similar experiences about online inclusiveness. So in a meeting, it's a lot easier for someone that's very loud or assertive to dominate and contribute. And we often talk about how do you help people that are quieter or prefer to reflect and consider their response to contribute in a meeting. But when we're online, it's a little bit of a leveler because you're all just a little square on a screen. And it's a lot easier to mute people and for people to contribute. And one of the challenges we're finding as we now go to the true hybrid element of hybrid working is how do we keep those benefits that we experience from the remote part, less distractions, easier for people to contribute, a lot easier to work with colleagues that are geographically dispersed. How do we keep some of those advantages whilst we do want to, in some places, look at coming back into physical spaces? What do we use those physical spaces for? Is it more for onboarding, for training, for group collaboration? But some of the main takeaways or experiences that we've had both at Thomas, Brompton, and with other partners that we work with is everyone reacts differently. I think that's a given. There is no silver bullet solution, unfortunately. People are complicated, and how people react to the demands of working in a more hybrid manner has huge positives for some, challenges for others, but we can help people be more effective and be happier and healthier through some of these changes in their working world by knowing more about them. The more we know about people, the more tailored and personalized we can make our support. Someone online commented that there is so much being asked of line managers at the moment, and I agree. There is a lot. I mean, HR and L&D practitioners, line managers, business leaders, there is a lot that we're all being asked to do to help the people that we're responsible for, and it's tough. And what we're trying to do here and what our partnership with Brompton shows is that we can help organizations get that insight a little bit quicker. We can try to help people come to those conclusions of, this is the topic I need to support this person on, when you then go and have the conversation with them. So personalizing support is really important. Hard to do. In large organizations, it focuses then on equipping managers so that they can take this insight and personalize the support that they're providing. Focusing on teams, as Gavin mentioned, exercises with teams and groups, adapting to what does hybrid or flexible working look like in your organization is not just about each individual. How do teams interact? How do groups interact, whether they are the same department and group or whether they're working across different groups? In some places where we're seeing success is where people are adapting physical spaces where practical to focus more on collaborative group space. I think quite often consistent feedback we're finding, regardless of personality style, is coming into the office to just sit and do your job is not really the driving force unless people are struggling with space at home, which is a separate challenge. We're finding groups getting together to actually just spend time as people, getting to know each other, is a big demand. And I think the absolute main takeaway is we can help organizations measure what matters. There are so many different data points we can be looking at. There is so much valuable information we can gather. In that mix, I would, as a psychologist, obviously strongly say that looking at people's behavioral and personality styles is just such critical insight, specifically because it can just help us get to the right conversation quicker. If you know that somebody might face a challenge with taking on too much work, setting themselves extremely high standards that they don't want to miss, maybe you can help them prioritize their work or let them know that it's okay to let something drop or when something's good enough. If you know that somebody experiences stress far more quickly than average, you can get that insight to know what best advice and support they might need to continue being effective. There's no right or wrong, good or bad profile. It helps you understand how best can you personalize support for a person. And if we know that insight, it helps us all do the stuff we're doing anyway. We're trying to help people be happy, healthy, and productive at work. But having some of this insight can just help us get to those outcomes a little bit sooner. So that's all from me so far. Gavin, any additional comments or statements?
I think the only other thing for me is to really touch on the well-being aspect. And, you know, it's been a tough almost 2 years, and you know, there is an element of feedback using the Thomas reports that can really get managers to understand how they need to be more empathetic with their employees, and as a result, as a business, react so that we can signpost them quicker to mental health services, which we've had to do as a business. We recognise people wouldn't necessarily always come forward, so it's how do we get people access without essentially need to come to speak to somebody in HR or to their line managers. So it helps us evolve that.
And we've had some great comments as we've been talking from people online about different ways that people have been adapting to it, and seeing how encouraging people to use office spaces but without mandating it, and the challenges there. Switching to patterns, Tracy here saying, switching to patterns of having monthly get-togethers in the office and using the space, but having people work remotely for their core day job and roles. Any questions from people in the room from what you've seen today before we close the session? And if you don't want to ask a question in public, of course, you can come and see myself and Gavin at stand G22. However, there is something else as well. Not only can you talk to us more, and we will be as charming as we can possibly be and have a coffee with you and talk more about hybrid working, you also have the chance to win a bike from Brompton's. So we'll be running a raffle. So come and chat to us.
Just point out, not this one, because this is mine. But,
Yes, not this particular bike, but a very similar bike.
Very similar.
But come and chat to us. We've had half an hour. There's only so much we can share. There's so much research that we're doing at Thomas. There's so much more to the story at Brompton's and what they're doing and from their growth. Everyone online has been sharing lots of thoughts. I'm sure you've all had different experiences. I've seen people nodding along and going, not sure if I agree in places. Come and chat to us. We're here for the next 2 days. Honestly, I'd love it if we could finish this event. If you loved what you saw, if you disagreed with absolutely everything we've just said, please come and talk to us and tell us. We just want to learn more and hear about what your experiences have been with hybrid working. So for everyone in the room and everyone online, thank you so much
Thank you
for your time.